All right, we are back on Play It Forward with Bat-Sheva today, filmmaker. The film is In This Life. Bat-Sheva, thank you so much. Can you introduce yourself and the film?
Sure. My name is Bat-Sheva Guez. I'm the director and co-writer of In This Life, which I made with Robbie Fairchild, former New York City ballet dancer. And the film explores basically the stages of grief and the different ways that a person kind of experience grief, which is a very verbal emotional state. And so if it's something you can't really talk about, then how can you show it? And we show this through dance and scenes and narrative movement and performance art. And each act illustrates a different phase of grief. And each act is choreographed by a different, really amazing choreographer. So we're able to kind of go in and
Interesting.
out of different worlds and collaborate with some really amazing people.
Is it the stages in grief according to Kubler-Ross?
The anger, acceptance,
Yeah, yeah, I think that's
those
Kubler-Ross.
phases. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Cool. Well, it was certainly really well done. It's a really ambitious short film. We got a lot of sets, a lot of scenes, lights, dancing, choreography. Um, the first question, grief and the exploration of grief, and the thing, you have a haiku, I believe, that sets up the film, and it says, "In this life we walk on the roof of hell, gazing at flowers." And with that as like the preface and the theme of exploration of grief and the stages of grief and how ultimately to get through to grief, which is really well done conceptually through this piece. Um, what is it in your life experience that said, "Hey, I'm going to write and direct this"?
Um, yeah, so ultimately I had worked with Robbie Fairchild on a couple different projects through our lives together and came to him at one point and said, "Oh, do you want to make a dance film?" And he said, "Yes." And so we came together to see, oh, like what kind of stories are moving us right now? And both of us are really moved by the idea of grief and loss. He was going through big changes in his emotional life and personal life and was grieving the person he used to be as he's emerging as this new person. And I myself had also had some loss in my life at that time. And one of the things we were thinking about ultimately, like when we are done with this film, we're like, oh, let's put it on social media because everybody is scrolling, like lost in the scroll of, so we were thinking, oh, let's put it on social media. Everybody's lost in the scroll of like this competitive living on Instagram. I'm like, oh, look at how amazing my life is. But in between, there are people who are suffering, who are grieving, who are mourning the loss of something in their lives. And we're like, let's meet them there and say, oh, you're not alone. Like, we are here with you. This is a universal experience. And grief is the universal experience that no one is immune from, that everyone goes through. And yet there are no words to express it. There are very few words available in our language to comfort someone who's going through grief. So if you can't talk, then let's dance and let's find ways to show compassion and comfort and understanding through that. So together we're like both really excited by that idea and trying to kind of mapped out for each phase of grief in this kind of old school model of how grief works, which is now less uh, popular, but imagining like, oh, how do you illustrate anger? How do you illustrate depression? For me, it was like, oh, imagining depression as being kind of a weight on your shoulders that makes even the most simple tasks hard. And so we imagine like a depression monster that kind of crawls out of his shirt and drapes over his body and kind of weights him down. And he struggles with it even in day-to-day tasks like going out to dinner, kind of a thing. So yeah.
Cool. So the piece starts off, and the way he's dancing and moving, it's the manner is depicts all as if he is being manipulated by something. There's like a puppetry to it. So he's not
Mhm.
necessarily moving to the music, but being forced into different
Yeah.
postures. So, that's the way it starts off, from something that is not volitional. It's this quality of being, taken over. And then he goes, there are different set scene changes. He's going to the church seeking God, going to nature to seek nature within the water scene, kind of struggling between this drowning and surfacing, and then going to the companionship and trying to be, back immersion to society. And nothing seems to be working until he gets to the last scene, which is this kind of void, this room, and there are these layers of silks, and there's a screen projection, and he's sort of going beyond the screen projections of himself to go deeper, deeper into the layers of himself. And there, seemingly, that is the path towards, the resolution. And first, we have to go through all these, um, go to these places, and maybe even postures that aren't fulfilling, that they don't quite cut it, and then we have to go inward. Ultimately, it's the journeys that seems to be depicted in terms of the message of how do we handle grief in a way that is healthy for us. So as a viewer now, having the insights of being a writer, and a director on it, how do you see the film? What do you see as the takeaway, the message, the meaning for you?
Yeah, what I wanted to do with the film was to create something that had so many different layers of meaning. So every choice that I made in the film was very like thoughtful and thought out, and we spent a long time having each visual element in the film has a deep meaning. And you can just sit back and watch the film and enjoy it, or you can kind of unpack it and kind of crack through the things, which kind of just addresses the complexity of life and the complexity of this emotion. For me, a lot of the things that we think about with grief is you're mourning the person you used to be and the life you thought you would have. If you experience a loss like a death, or you experience a loss like a big major life change or something, a lot of that grief comes from, oh, I used to be this person, or oh, I used to visualize this life for myself, and now that life is gone. And how do you come to terms with that? And how do you, and there's also elements of control that are interplay with that as well, because there's so little we have control over, right? We're standing on the roof of hell, like at any point that can crack and you just fall through. And so a lot of the mask elements at the beginning with the man's like manipulating his face, a lot of that has to do with controlling oneself or ideas imposed upon you. This film was at the time Robbie was coming out, and he was coming to terms with his own sexuality. And so he was thinking a lot about the grief of like, oh, trying to manipulate himself into an idea of masculinity or into an idea of who he should be, and having to kind of break through all those things. And then at the end with sort of acceptance, there is like layers of a person, and like kind of you kind of take a step back and look at yourself and who you were, right? And who that person is no longer anymore, and kind of being okay and saying goodbye to that person and accepting that person and accepting all the layers of that person. And so we have him kind of peeling back layers of fabric. And for me as a director, I just love playing with that kind of projection mapping,
Yeah.
where you're just with texture. Like I'm big on texture and layers and different ways you can use the medium of film, because film is still a relatively young medium. There's still a lot of options of what we can do with it. And so what happens when you project an image on another image and then shoot that image and watch somebody peel back layers? And so we had a fabulous time making that projection. And then other things, even like bargaining in the water, like when we were talking with Andrea Miller, our choreographer, it was interesting when you think about bargaining as like fighting with water. Like you can't fight water, you can't win with water, you can't hold water in your hands, it just kind of goes through. So there's this idea of like struggling in the water and bargaining and trying to get out of the situation that you're trapped in.
That's cool. You said acceptance. I mean, that's like the key to unlock grief and unpack it. So how have you in your life learned to get there in the most easy way possible without creating a bunch of damage?
Yeah. I think for me, and it's different for everybody, but if you're dealing with a grief like a loss, someone you care about, not fighting it, like grief for me, and I think for oftentimes when you're dealing with a loss, it comes in this big wave. and not kind of struggling against it, but just letting that wave kind of pass through you and breathing it out and just acknowledging like this is going to be very painful and sad and just like a tight squeeze, but if you just kind of breathe out, like the wave will eventually pass through you and you'll get a break until
Yeah.
the next comes.
Yeah.
And then over time, the waves get a little bit easier to bear. And I also saw this like very kind of funny metaphor on Instagram about it, but I probably gonna butcher it if I try to repeat it. But this artist made a wonderful art piece where she was talking about like grief is like butter. And in the beginning, it's like very hard and firm, but after a while, it kind of gets folded in and becomes part of who you are, and you just carry it with you, and it's part of like the sweetness and richness of your person.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really beautiful. And
Yeah, it
so,
is.
the
That's a
grief is,
really beautiful thing.
yeah.
Yeah. I think a part of that is because it broadens your awareness and capacity for compassion with
Hmm.
others, which is really enriches your life, makes it
Yeah.
bigger.
Yeah.
It's interesting how it does that.
And it is kind of like love, right? Like the
Yeah,
more the loss of someone you care about, like that grief is a manifestation of love. So,
yeah, yeah. Attachment.
mhm.
Yeah. Um, well, thanks for that. Last question, play it forward. How have you been personally changed since making this movie?
I had a wonderful time making this movie. It was one of those really special projects where every collaborator that joined the project elevated it to a level beyond even what I thought was possible. And that was just so special. I had people come to me after the film, um, people who were helping us just with the location. Like there was these people that were working in one of our locations, and their whole job was just to keep us from breaking anything. And by the end, they were like throwing feathers in the background on a ladder, and like they were just so moved to be part of the art. And they came to me afterward and said, "This is why we make art." And it just was just one of those projects where like all these amazing, talented dancers and performers and choreographers and production designers and lighting designers and cinematographers, everybody just creating that kind of flow and everyone was moved by the project because grief is so universal. So everyone can kind of put their own loss into it and channel that and make it a sort of cathartic experience for themselves. So it was just one of those projects that you hope to have again, where you find flow with your collaborators, where everybody is creating and elevating and making art that is complex, that you don't understand on the first pass, and you can talk about with people and share. And that was really special. So I think, yeah, all it did was kind of whet my appetite for I want more. Like, let's do this again. And I think that's important because as a filmmaker, so much of the work is trying to make the next piece of work. And so you need to be fueled by the love, by the dopamine rush, by the hit of adrenaline you get when you make wonderful art with a wonderful team. And so that can feed you, because the pandemic hit shortly after that, and there was a period where I wasn't able to make things for a while. And to have that, like it fuels you for a while till the next project. And I think that was really special.
Awesome. Bat-Sheva, thank you, filmmaker, writer, director, for being on Play It Forward. Till next time, everybody, we're out.
Appreciate it.
You got
Bye.
it. Bye.